everyone, it's Maddie.
I'm V, and today we're going to be doing the second half of our May wrap-up.
These are all the books we read just before and actually on our vacation, which happened at the end of May.
Part 1 will be linked in the cards, and we also did a weekend readathon, so we will not be re-wrapping up those books as we talk about them throughout the video, so that will also be in the cards and the description too if you want to catch up with everything we've already read in May.
So we read a few books together and we'll start with those.
We started by reading two poetry collections, Milk and Honey and The Princess Saves Herself in this one, and these are two collections that have been hyped on BookTube because they're really accessible as the poems are short and they talk about female empowerment and abusive relationships and learning to love yourself. To me, it didn't feel like poetry. I was just so confused at the fact that sometimes these were just sentences chopped up into bits that it really took away from my enjoyment of the actual words, and I think reading them one after the other was a bad idea because then you just realise how similar they are, and I like my poems to resonate with me. So when you read the same thing or the same topic, even some of the same repeated images, which makes you think that anyone could have written these poems, which is upsetting because they were so hyped in the BookTube community. I really thought they were going to do more for me.
Next we read Opel Plumstead by Jacqueline Wilson. This tells the story of Opel after her family deteriorates when her father is sent to prison for embezzlement. She has to pull out of her scholarship position at her school so she can support her family by taking a job at the local sweets factory. Here she meets the owner of the sweets factory and gets on her good side, then she's invited to suffragette meetings. This was really great, but we had the same problems with this book as we did with Clover Moon, that it felt like a story that was just a series of episodes rather than something that was building towards something really big that would then get resolved at the end. The one thing we are slightly disappointed with as well is the fact that the suffragette movement wasn't a bigger part of this story. There's a little rosette that says Votes for Women on the cover, and that led us to think that it would be a huge theme, but it actually doesn't come up in the book until 300 pages through, and this is like an over 500 page book. However, there's just something about Jacqueline Wilson's writing style that is so comfortable and lovely to read. She makes these time periods so accessible for any reader of any age.
Next I have The Archived by Victoria Schwab, and this is a story about an archive system which basically boils down to Mackenzie's role as a glorified nanny telling the dead to go back to sleep. The Archive, because it was written in 2013, feels very much like a 2013 book, and I've moved on from that as a reader. I'm not a big fan of supernatural stories and I care not for the love triangle. So although it had Victoria's like beautiful writing style and it was a well-told story, I really liked the integration of the past and the present. I just wasn't interested in the actual concept as much as I hoped.
Next I read Bloodlines by Rochelle Mead. It's a continuation, kind of like a spin-off, with half the characters from the Vampire Academy series that had their stories left open. They're also the characters that I didn't really enjoy that much in the original series, but I'm so pleased to see them like this because it means that I can grow to love them in a new light now that they're in the spotlight. There's a boarding school, there's a mystery, there's trust issues, and in that way it's kind of transparent if you know the formula for Vampire Academy, but I still really enjoyed it.
Next I read See How They Lie by Sue Woolman, and this is the story of May, who's grown up in a wellness centre because her dad is the creator slash CEO. But as she gets older and new kids arrive and weird things start happening, she realises that this utopia has a shady background. I adored this book. For many reasons. I adored it for what it was, and I adored it for what it wasn't. This is a slow-paced story, even though it's a thriller. Like, look at this cover. You expect you're going to get some, like, nail-biting experience, but you don't. And I really appreciated that it was just clever. It wasn't trying to throw, like, all of these bells and whistles at you. It was this slow, unwinding story that you could actually sink your teeth into. It wasn't too fast, so you felt like, I'm not really sure how you're connecting the dots, but it wasn't too slow where you were 5 paces ahead of the characters. I read this in one sitting, start to finish, and I'm so glad I did. Even if it doesn't seem like your genre, I would still recommend it because it's just an enjoyable read.
And then I read Lying About Last Summer by Sue Woolman, which was her debut, and this tells the story of Skye, who's going to a bereavement camp after her sister died, and she's struggling to deal with it. At the camp, which is kind of like an adventure camp, they do zip lining and abseiling and things like that, which was really exciting. She starts to receive messages from her sister and doesn't know who's sending them, so the rest of the book is her trying to find out who it is. She was just so calm about it all and dealt with it really well, especially with the people around her. If ever she saw someone with a phone, she was suspicious, but not too much to put them off talking to her. And after watching Pretty Little Liars and see them deal with the exact same thing and go about it the entirely wrong way, it was so refreshing to see a character that was just taking it into her stride. But there's so much heart to it because of the family element, and you slowly learn more about the past and what actually happened with Skye's sister and how she died throughout the book. I think the reason why me and B both both loved these books so much as well is because we got to read the entire books outside when it was super sunny, and we just sat opposite each other reading them, and it was so delightful, so we ended up both giving these books 5 stars.
Next, I read Not So Quiet by Helen Zena Smith, and this is sold as an autobiographical story about female ambulance drivers in World War I, although Helen Zena Smith is actually just a pseudonym for this other author whose name I can't remember. So it's fiction, it's not actual real life, but it's just told in such an engaging and realistic way. It's insanely depressing at the end, but I felt for these characters. I'm taking part in an internship which is based around this book, so I had to read it to get contextual knowledge, and now I'm just really interested in reading more World War I stories, especially with females at the centre, so if you have any recommendations, please leave them in the comments.
Next I have Orange Boy by Patrice Lawrence, and this has just won the YA Book Prize, and it's so well deserved, because this is the story about Marlon, who ends up having some drugs in his pocket and a dead girl next to him within the first chapter, and things just go downhill from there. It's all about gang culture and how that can really affect your life. It deals somewhat with police brutality and how we're less likely to believe the narratives of certain minority groups, and it was just terrible to read because you knew that that was actually the reality that we're living in. It's quite a large book, it's over 400 pages, but I managed to read it all in one day just because it was so compelling. I wanted things to work out for the main character, and I was just driven through the story with that motivation. If you're really interested in reading something that's diverse and a little outside of your comfort zone maybe, because it's a contemporary but definitely has a really raw edge feel, then I couldn't recommend this one more.
Next, I read 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher, and Maddie read this one earlier on in the month, and I shared her feelings completely, so I won't bother to go over them anymore, apart from saying Hannah is a yes, Clay is a no.
Next, I read The Museum of Heartbreak by Meg Leder, and this was the book I chose to read on the flight. This tells the story of Penelope, who's curating a museum exhibit over items that she has from this relationship with a boy called Keats, who is my first manic pixie dream boy. I've never seen it with a boy before, but that was definitely interesting. I was expecting this to be a lot like Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler, which turned out to be one of my surprise favourite books of that year, but it really wasn't. I was expecting it to have more of an emotional core. As it says heartbreak on the cover, I was expecting like breakdowns, crying fits, but that just didn't happen. It was like Penelope realised that she really wasn't the girl for Keats and they didn't work together, and then just decided, well, that's okay. And so I think it's kind of mistitled. It should just be like, girl gets in relationship, realises it doesn't work out, moves on. I know that's not as dynamic and probably no one would read it, but still. I really loved the relationship between Penny and her best friend F. That was lovely, and from the very beginning you realise that they're better suited for each other than Keats ever was for Penelope, so throughout the whole book I was just waiting for the inevitable to happen and for them to get together.
Next, I read One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus, another one that Maddie read earlier on in the month because I was just taking all her recommendations on board. I read this one on the flight. I was listening to these stories. I also listened to 13 Reasons Why, which gave it like an extra resonance. This book, however, I think I would have preferred reading it in front of me, but travel sickness, you feel? Whereas Maddie really enjoyed this story, I feel like I missed something. The way that it sets up this Breakfast Club dynamic and then subverts their personalities, so you've got the gay jock. I also thought that those subversions had been done before as well, so I really struggled to find an individual part to this story. However, I really did enjoy the relationship between Bronwyn and Nate. Even though it was like pretty girl meets rebel boy, I'm trash for that. I enjoyed the story. It was a fun time. It just wasn't what I was expecting. So I'll give it 3 stars. It would make a super dynamic movie, but I think if I'd like paid more attention, maybe the characters wouldn't have felt so samey.
Next I read When Dimple Met Richie by Sandia Manon, and I'm kind of really nervous to talk about this one because I only gave it 1 star. Oh man. This was overall just not a good book. He was going to read it with me, and she made it 20% through before DNFing, and I thought I could not finish this, but for some reason I was just really wanting to like it, and so I pushed my way through the whole thing because I'd only heard positive things about it. I was like, it has to get better from here, but it just didn't. And I wrote a Goodreads review that has like all of my examples of things I had a problem with, and like really well articulates what I thought was wrong with the book, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. Normally I end up giving 1-star reviews to books that have really bad representation, and the representation of When Dimple Met Richie was my favourite part of the story. Anytime they were talking about their culture or just conversing together about their different family backgrounds and how that had influenced them now and their ideals on romance, I thought that was really fascinating, and I wish the story had focused more on that. But the actual thing that was wrong with the story was the plot. I think that comes from the trouble of everyone just saying that that this is a cute story about two teens that fall in love in an arranged marriage trickery against different financial backgrounds. And that's what it was on the blurb. But actually in the story, it's about Dimple who wants to take part in this 6-week coding workshop, and Richie just happens to be there because he's signed up because Dimple's going to be there, and they do zero coding throughout the whole story. I thought I was going to be reading about a girl who was interested in STEM subjects, and I didn't get that. Instead, the book focuses much more on this random talent contest that's happening for no apparent reason, and it says that the people that win this talent contest are more likely to win the coding contest, and I'm like, what? They don't mesh together. And so it just felt extremely bitty. And it's so sad because if I'd known all of those things, like the plot was a bit all over the place, maybe I would have liked it so much, but it feels like I'm the only person that picked up on it out of all the people I'd seen before. But this has definitely been a positive experience for me about sharing negative opinions, because I got some great feedback on my review. Even people that said they loved the book, really appreciated having that review with the examples, so I'll leave that in the description if you want to look.
Next I read I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, and I have been meaning to read this for a really long time. It's one of my 5 books I wanted to read in 2017, and I'm so pleased I finally got around to it, and of course I'm kicking myself I didn't get to it sooner. This is the story of twins Noah and Jude, and it is told in 2 interchangeable halves. You have the Invisible Museum, which is Noah's story when he's 13 and 14, and Jude's story, which is the history of luck, and that happens when she's 16. Initially, I was really annoyed that we were getting them at those ages because I was far more interested in Jude at 13 and Noah at 16, but that wouldn't have created such a good story because you need them to be those ages for dramatic irony. It's kind of one of those where you get so far through and you're like, this is really, really well written. So this is about those twins and how they fall apart and fall back together after their mother's death, an art school mix-up, and a hecka-ton of boy trouble. I just loved how this was constructed most of all. I feel like I've been reading a lot of stories where the story is fun, the writing not so much. This was where I enjoyed the writing most out of everything. I just thought it was incredibly well crafted, and I really want to know Jandy Nelson's process for this. Was she using like flashcards? How did she plan it all out in her head? Because I would not have been able to keep this straight. It's just a really, really impressive story, and I can't wait to get to The Skies Everywhere because I hope I'll be in awe of that story too.
Next, I read Inkspell by Cornelia Funk, and I think this deserves like the biggest round of applause because this book has been on my shelf for 7 years. 7 years and I haven't read it. I think the size has always intimidated me, as well as my unfiltered love for Inkheart. I've read that book 4 times. I love it to pieces. Every single page. I've got like the first 50 pages committed to memory at least. So I was really nervous to read this one, and because it had been so long, I thought I'd grown out of the story and wouldn't be able to get as much out of it if I'd have read it when I was 14, especially because that's the age Meggie is in this book. I thought it would resonate with me way much more in the past. But boy was I wrong. This story is still exactly the same, and I think it's one of those narratives that stands outside of age groups. Although I think that it kind of lost the plot a little bit, and it is quite long, so of course that was going to happen, I still really enjoyed it, and it managed to capture the essence of Inkheart whilst also having this extremely fantastical element to it now that they're actually in the ink world. So now I just have ink death to conquer, and hopefully it'll get done within the next 5 years.
I guess we've done this anachronistically, but I read Inkheart as well. I read 50 pages of this in 2008. I was actually the first of the 2 of us to read it. I put it down, probably because it was so big and I was more interested in like fairy stories. I passed it on to Maddie, she loved it, I gave up and just like went back into the shadows. I was trapped with this on holiday and I was like, I'm gonna finish it. This is one of Maddie's favourite books, and it's kind of her recommendation that I've ignored for the longest time, similar to her ignoring Inkspell. I've ignored this. I really, really liked it. Don't get me wrong, it was a fun story, but I also felt the entire time I could watch the movie, which I've watched multiple times and really enjoy, and get the same amount of enjoyment, if not more. And the writing was also really different to anything I'd read before because it was like a close third that was done really successfully. When Dimple Met Richie, the 20% I read, I mostly gave up on because that's also a close third and it was terrible.
Then I read The Host by Stephanie Meyer. This is the story of an alien species who just very calmly take over the bodies of different species and control them and make the Earth a better place. And Wanderer, or as she becomes later Wanda, takes over the body of Melanie, but Melanie is a really strong mind and she doesn't completely give up her body to the host, so they coexist within the body together, and that's a really sweet relationship that develops. They go from like hating each other to feeling like sisters, and it made me tear up at the end because it was just so beautiful to see them communicate that way. Ian falls in love with Wanda, and it's really special because Wanda thinks that he's only in love with Melanie's body, but in reality he's in love with Wanda as a person, as they exist separately, and it's like one of the cutest romances ever. I was way, way, way more invested with Ian and Wanda's relationship than Melanie and Jared's, mostly because Jared was a poop in this book. There's so much physical and emotional abuse given towards Wanda, mostly by Jared, that I just couldn't like him. But the one character I loved to pieces in this story was Wanda. I think she's become one of my fictional role models because she's so strong and like badass, but also really sympathetic and has a very soft side. I ended up giving it 5 stars because it got such an emotional reaction from me. There were so many scenes throughout, but they were so raw and great and missing from the film, and I think that's important that I was able to gain more out of this reading experience than just watching the film.
Next I read City of Saints and Thieves by Natalie C. Anderson, and this is the story of Tina, who's a refugee, and she's looking for the murderer of her mother. So Goodreads will have you believe that this is Gone Girl meets Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I would have to give that a resolute no, because there's not a thriller aspect to this story, even though that's the kind of genre that they are pitching it as. Each chapter opens with like a tip of how to be a good thief, and whilst this was interesting and it did push the story forward, I just wasn't engaged. I really, really enjoyed the setting though. It's probably one of the first books I've read set in Africa, and even though the town is a fictional one, the author has like a note of all of her inspirations that she drew from different areas to create the setting of this book, which I really enjoyed. If gentle thrillers are more your thing, which they are not necessarily mine, I like if it's going to be searching for a murderer, I need some action, then this is probably for you.
So those were all the books that we read in the latter half of May and the very, very beginning of June.
Thank you everyone so much for watching, and we'll see you on our next video.
Bye!